Arizona Territory, 1887. Dust swirled across the parched landscape as the merciless summer sun beat down on the small cattle ranch nestled in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. The land was as unforgiving as the men who sought to tame it, and 26-year-old Kieran Dawson had long ago decided that surviving here required isolation. Loneliness was simply the price one paid for security in this harsh territory. Kieran wiped sweat from his brow as he hammered the final nail into the corral fence. His ranch, the Broken Arrow, wasn't much compared to the sprawling operations further north, but it was his, paid for with 6 years of backbreaking work, careful planning, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone close enough to complicate matters. The young rancher had watched too many good men lose everything by trusting the wrong person. Out here, attachments were liabilities. Love was a luxury that got men killed. A man alone answers to nobody, Kieran muttered to himself, the mantra his father had drilled into him before a band of raiders had left him orphaned at 16. His lean, muscular frame moved with the economical grace of someone accustomed to hard labor. The sleeves of his faded blue shirt rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. Despite the dirt and sweat of ranch work, there was an undeniable handsomeness to his features. Sharp jawline covered with light stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his shirt. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Kieran from his thoughts. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip as he squinted against the sun. Visitors were rare out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, and rarely brought anything but trouble. The rider appeared from behind a stand of mesquite trees, and Kieran's grip on his weapon loosened slightly when he realized it was only Hank Prescott, the aging postmaster from Willow Creek. "Afternoon, Dawson." Hank called, reining his mule to a stop. "Got something that couldn't wait for your monthly trip to town." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew an envelope. Kieran took the letter, immediately recognizing his uncle's handwriting. "Much obliged, Hank. You want some water before heading back?" The old man declined, and after a brief exchange of local news, turned his mule around and headed back toward town. Kieran broke the seal on the letter, scanning its contents with growing concern. His uncle Maxwell, his only living relative, was sending his goddaughter to stay at the Broken Arrow. The young woman, Abigail Reed was her name, had recently lost her parents to influenza in St. Louis and needed somewhere to recover from her grief while decisions about her future were made. She would be arriving on tomorrow's stage. "Damn it all to hell," Kieran cursed, crushing the letter in his fist. A woman here on his ranch. The very thought made his stomach knot with anxiety. Women were complicated, demanding creatures who required protection, comfort, and conversation, all things Kieran had deliberately eliminated from his life. Women brought expectations, attachments, vulnerability. They asked questions that stirred up painful memories. They made a man soft when he needed to be hard to survive. He had built his life around the certainty that he was better off alone. Safer, the frontier was no place for softness or sentiment. Yet here was his uncle, the one man who had helped him establish this ranch, asking him to open his home to a city woman who would undoubtedly bring nothing but trouble to his carefully ordered existence. Kieran spent a restless night imagining all the ways this Abigail Reed would disrupt his life. By morning, he had resigned himself to the inevitable. He would meet her stage, explain the unsuitability of his ranch for a lady's comfort, and arrange for her to stay at the boarding house in Willow Creek until other accommodations could be found. It was the only sensible solution. The following afternoon found him shifting uncomfortably on the wooden bench outside Willow Creek's general store, watching as the stage from Tucson rumbled down the dusty Main Street. His hat pulled low over his eyes, Kieran tried to ignore the knot of tension between his shoulder blades. This would be simple, quick. He would explain the situation, be firm but polite, and be back at his ranch before sunset. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and the driver hopped down to open the door. An elderly couple disembarked first, followed by a traveling salesman, and finally, a young woman who paused to look around the small frontier town with wide eyes. Kieran felt the air leave his lungs. Abigail Reed was nothing like the matronly, frowning spinster he had conjured in his imagination. She was young, no more than 22 by his estimation, with large blue eyes set in a heart-shaped face. Her honey-blonde hair was swept up beneath a modest traveling hat, with a few wayward curls escaping to frame her face. She wore a cornflower blue traveling dress that, while dusty from the journey, was clearly of fine quality. There was a delicacy to her features that seemed entirely out of place in the rough-hewn frontier town. Rising to his feet, Kieran reluctantly approached her. "Miss Reed," he asked, removing his hat. "I'm Kieran Dawson, Maxwell Dawson's nephew." Those blue eyes brightened with recognition. "Mr. Dawson, how kind of you to meet me." Her voice carried the refined accent of Eastern schooling, but there was a warmth to it that caught him off guard. "I cannot thank you enough for opening your home to me during this difficult time." Kieran cleared his throat, suddenly finding his rehearsed speech about the unsuitability of his ranch lodged somewhere behind his Adam's apple. "About that, Miss Reed." "Please call me Abigail," she interrupted with a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to radiant. "Or Abby if you prefer. We're to be housemates after all. Formality seems unnecessary." "That's just it, Miss Abigail. My ranch isn't exactly set up for visitors, especially lady visitors. It's a working cattle operation. Rough. Isolated, no comforts to speak of. I was thinking the boarding house in town might." Her smile faltered and Kieran felt an unexpected pang of guilt. "I understand," she said, her voice softer now. "Uncle Maxwell perhaps did not explain my situation fully. I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Dawson. My parents' estate is tied up in legal matters, and she paused, composing herself. "I assure you I will not be a burden. I can cook and clean, I've nursed the sick, I'm stronger than I appear." Something in her quiet dignity gave Kieran pause. He had expected tears or demands, not this calm resolve. Before he could formulate a response, the stagecoach driver dropped her trunk at their feet. "Last bag, miss," he announced. "That'll be all." Kieran looked from the trunk to the young woman, knowing he was at a crossroads. Every instinct honed by years on the frontier told him to stick to his plan. Women were complications, and complications got men killed out here. But there was something about the way Abigail Reed stood there, clutching her small handbag with white knuckles even as she maintained her composure, that made refusal seem impossible. "It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch," he said finally, resigning himself to at least a temporary arrangement. "We should get moving if we want to arrive before dark." The relief on her face was palpable, though she simply nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." "Kieran," he corrected gruffly, lifting her trunk with ease. "If we're to be housemates, as you say, might as well use first names." The journey to the Broken Arrow was largely silent. Kieran drove the wagon while Abigail sat beside him, occasionally commenting on the rugged beauty of the landscape. He found himself studying her surreptitiously, noting how she didn't complain about the heat or the rough road, things that the few town women he'd encountered seemed to find endlessly troublesome. As they crested the final rise that revealed the Broken Arrow spread in the valley below, Kieran felt a sudden self-consciousness about his home. The main house was sturdy but plain, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small sitting area. The barn and corral were well-maintained but utilitarian. It was a bachelor's ranch built for function rather than comfort or beauty. "There it is," he said, nodding toward the buildings. "Not much to look at." Abigail leaned forward slightly. "It's lovely," she said with what seemed like genuine admiration. "You built all this yourself." "Most of it had help with the barn raising." He flicked the reins, urging the horses down the slope. "Like I said, it's no place for a lady. The spare room's never been used. Beds there, but not much else." "I'm sure it will be perfect," she replied, and Kieran found himself wondering at her optimism. Either she was naive about frontier living, or she possessed a resilience he hadn't expected. The first few days of their awkward cohabitation were a study in mutual adjustment. Kieran deliberately spent from dawn until dusk working the ranch, coming in only for meals and sleep. Abigail, true to her word, took over the domestic duties without complaint. He returned from the range the first evening to find the previously functional but Spartan kitchen filled with the aroma of real cooking, something beyond the beans and hardtack he'd grown accustomed to. "Hope you don't mind," she said when he stopped short in the doorway, staring at the actual table setting and steaming pot of stew. "I found some vegetables in your garden patch that were about to bolt, and there was a rabbit in one of your traps." The stew was better than anything Kieran had eaten in years, but he merely nodded his thanks, uncomfortable with the domestic transformation taking place in his home. By the third day, the house was noticeably cleaner. The spare room had been arranged to accommodate her few possessions, and wildflowers had appeared in a jar on the kitchen table. It was all wrong, this softness, this femininity invading his carefully constructed fortress of solitude. Yet Kieran found himself lingering a bit longer at meals, answering her careful questions about the ranch operations with more detail than strictly necessary. There was something disarming about Abigail Reed, some quality that made his usual taciturn nature difficult to maintain. On the fifth morning, Kieran was saddling his horse before sunrise when he heard the cabin door open. Abigail stood on the porch dressed in a simple skirt and shirtwaist, her blonde hair braided and wrapped around her head. "Good morning," she called. "I've packed you a lunch," she approached, holding out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, just some bread and cold chicken, but I thought." "You don't need to do that," Kieran interrupted, uncomfortable with the gesture. "I know," she replied with that steady gaze that somehow made him feel simultaneously seen and off balance. "But I wanted to. You work from sunup to sundown. The least I can do is ensure you're properly fed." He took the bundle, nodding his thanks. As he mounted his horse, Abigail spoke again. "Kieran, I was wondering. Would it be possible for me to learn to ride? There's not much I can do confined to the house, and I'd like to be useful beyond cooking and cleaning." The request caught him off guard. Town women, in his limited experience, viewed horses as necessary evils for transportation, not as partners in work. "You've ridden before." My father kept horses in St. Louis, though they were carriage horses mostly. "But I'm a quick study." Kieran considered her request. Teaching her to ride would mean spending time with her, time that would disrupt his carefully maintained distance, yet refusing seemed unnecessarily cruel. "We'll start tomorrow," he said finally. "I've got a gentle mare that might suit you." The smile that brightened her face caused an unexpected warmth in his chest, a sensation Kieran promptly ignored as he turned his horse toward the south pasture. True to her word, Abigail proved to be a quick study with horses. Within a week, she was confidently riding the docile mare Kieran had selected for her, and by the end of the second week, she was accompanying him on shorter rides around the property. He found himself impressed by her willingness to learn and her lack of complaint about the physical demands of ranch life. "You're not what I expected," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. It had become something of a habit, these quiet moments as dusk settled over the land, a habit Kieran told himself was merely courtesy to his guest. "Oh, and what did you expect?" Abigail asked, her blue eyes reflecting the fading light. Kieran shrugged. Someone soft, city-bred, the kind who'd faint at the sight of a rattlesnake or complain about the heat and dust. She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch yard. "I may be city-bred, but my mother never tolerated weakness. She believed women should be accomplished in more than just embroidery and piano playing." Her expression sobered. "Besides, after nursing both my parents through influenza only to lose them anyway, a rattlesnake seems rather manageable by comparison." The quiet grief in her voice touched something in Kieran he thought long buried, his own loss, his own orphaning. He found himself sharing more than he'd intended. "Lost my folks when I was 16. Raiders hit our homestead while I was hunting. Came back to find everything gone." Abigail's hand reached out, resting lightly on his forearm. "I'm so sorry, Kieran." He should have pulled away, would have, a week earlier. Instead, he found himself continuing. "Uncle Maxwell took me in, helped me get started here when I turned 20. But I learned early that getting attached to people is a risk out here. Everyone leaves, one way or another." "Not everyone," she said softly. The words hung between them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Kieran felt a dangerous crack forming in the walls he'd built around himself, and he abruptly stood. "Early start tomorrow," he said gruffly. "Got to move the herd to the north pasture." Abigail nodded, accepting his retreat without comment. "Good night, then." That night, Kieran lay awake longer than usual, troubled by the realization that Abigail Reed was becoming something more than an unwelcome intrusion in his life. She was becoming a presence he anticipated rather than avoided, a voice he listened for, a smile that somehow lightened the burdens of the day. It was dangerous, this softening, this opening to another person. The frontier was unforgiving of such weakness. He had built his life on the principle that a man alone was a man in control of his own fate. Letting Abigail matter would only lead to pain when she inevitably left, as everyone always did. Yet despite these midnight resolutions to maintain his distance, Kieran found himself including Abigail more and more in the daily operations of the ranch. She proved surprisingly capable, learning to help with the vegetable garden, tending to the chickens, and even assisting with minor veterinary treatments for the livestock. "You've got a way with animals," he observed one afternoon as they treated a calf with a minor cut. Abigail had calmed the frightened animal with soft words and gentle hands while Kieran cleaned and bandaged the wound. "I've always found them easier to understand than people," she admitted, stroking the calf's neck. "Animals don't pretend, they don't hide their feelings behind polite words or social conventions." Kieran nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. "That's why I prefer them to most company. And here I thought it was just my sparkling conversation you were avoiding," she teased, a mischievous glint in her eyes. The comment caught him off guard, and to his own surprise, Kieran laughed, a rusty sound he scarcely recognized as his own. "Your conversation's fine, better than most." "High praise indeed from the stoic Mr. Dawson," she replied, but her smile took any sting from the words. As they walked back to the house, Abigail carrying the medical supplies and Kieran leading his horse, he found himself speaking without premeditation. "Town's having its Founders' Day celebration this Saturday. Usually avoid it myself, but thought you might want to go, meet some folks, have a change of scenery." Abigail looked up at him, clearly surprised by the offer. "I'd like that very much, but only if you'll come too. I wouldn't want to impose on anyone to escort me otherwise." The thought of spending an entire day surrounded by townsfolk, making small talk and enduring curious glances, made Kieran wince internally. But the alternative, sending Abigail with someone else, perhaps the blacksmith's wife or the pastor's family, seemed somehow worse. "I'll take you," he said, committing himself to what promised to be a thoroughly uncomfortable day for the simple pleasure of seeing her smile. That smile appeared immediately, brightening her entire face. "Thank you, it will be nice to wear something besides work clothes for a change." Saturday dawned clear and pleasantly warm for late September. Kieran had finished the morning chores and was cleaning up for the trip to town when Abigail emerged from her room. He stopped short, water dripping unnoticed from his freshly washed face. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her fair coloring and brought out flecks of emerald in her blue eyes. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elegant style that somehow managed to look both fashionable and practical. It wasn't an extravagant outfit by Eastern standards, he supposed, but on the frontier, it was a vision of refinement and femininity. "Is it too formal?" she asked, misinterpreting his silence. "I wasn't sure what would be appropriate." Kieran cleared his throat. "No, you look very nice." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could manage through the sudden tightness in his chest. The ride to town was filled with more conversation than Kieran typically engaged in over the course of a month. Abigail's excitement about the celebration was evident, and he found himself viewing the approaching town through new eyes, wondering how it would appear to someone accustomed to the sophistication of St. Louis. Willow Creek had made an effort for its annual celebration. Bunting decorated the storefronts, tables had been set up in the town square, and a makeshift dance floor had been constructed near where the town band was tuning their instruments. Children darted between adults, dogs barked excitedly at the commotion, and the air was filled with the smells of barbecue and freshly baked pies. As Kieran helped Abigail down from the wagon, he was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. His infrequent appearances in town had given him something of a reputation as a recluse, and the sight of him escorting a beautiful young woman was clearly providing fodder for gossip. "Dawson." "Didn't expect to see you today," called Sheriff Morgan, approaching with a friendly nod. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Abigail Reed," she answered for herself, extending her hand with a polite smile. "I'm staying with Mr. Dawson for a time. My godfather is his uncle." The explanation was simple and entirely proper, yet Kieran noted the flicker of speculation in the sheriff's eyes. News of their living arrangement would spread through the town before the first dance began, he was certain. "Well, Miss Reed, you're most welcome to Willow Creek," the sheriff replied. "I hope Dawson here has been treating you hospitably. He's not known for his social graces." Abigail's smile never wavered. "Kieran has been the perfect host. I've never felt more welcome anywhere." Her defense, unexpected and unnecessary, warmed something in Kieran's chest even as he maintained his usual stoic expression. The day progressed pleasantly enough, with Abigail charming virtually everyone she met. Kieran watched as she spoke easily with the shopkeeper's wife, cooed over the blacksmith's new baby, and listened with genuine interest to old Mr. Thornton's stories of the town's founding. There was nothing forced in her sociability. She seemed genuinely interested in people in a way Kieran had never understood. "Your young lady's quite something," commented Hank Prescott as they stood watching Abigail judge a children's sack race. "Been a while since we've had someone with her kind of class and kindness in these parts." "She's not my young lady," Kieran corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "She's just staying at the ranch temporarily." Hank gave him a knowing look. "If you say so, son, but word of advice from an old man, when something good comes your way out here, you'd be a fool not to grab hold with both hands." Before Kieran could respond, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began moving toward the dance floor. "I believe this is where you ask me to dance," came Abigail's voice as she appeared at his side, slightly breathless from cheering on the children. "I don't dance," Kieran said flatly, though the sight of her flushed cheeks and bright eyes made him momentarily reconsider. "Everyone dances," she countered, taking his hand with a boldness that surprised him. "And I haven't danced since before my parents fell ill. Please, Kieran, just one." He could have refused, should have, by all rights. Dancing meant holding her close, meant being the center of attention, meant acknowledging a connection he'd been trying to deny since her arrival. But the hope in her eyes undid his resistance. "One dance," he agreed reluctantly, allowing her to lead him toward the wooden platform. Kieran couldn't recall the last time he danced, but his body remembered the basic steps. Abigail moved with the natural grace he'd observed in her writing, following his lead easily despite his rusty execution. The feel of her hand in his, the light pressure of her other hand on his shoulder, the subtle scent of wildflowers that seemed to surround her, it all combined to make the experience both disorienting and strangely perfect. "You're not as terrible at this as you implied," she teased as they circled the floor. "Don't get used to it," he replied, but there was no edge to his voice. One dance became two, and by the third, Kieran found himself relaxing into the rhythm, less concerned with the curious glances of the townsfolk. There was a rightness to holding Abigail this way that defied his long-held conviction that attachments were dangerous. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit around the square, the band shifted to slower, more romantic tunes. Couples drew closer and the atmosphere changed from celebratory to intimate. Kieran knew he should suggest they head back to the ranch, but the words wouldn't come. "Thank you for today," Abigail said softly as they swayed to a gentle waltz. "For bringing me, for dancing, for all of it." "Wasn't so bad," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. She smiled up at him, and in the lantern light, her eyes seemed to hold all the stars of the Arizona sky. Kieran felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with the dance and everything to do with the way she had gradually, inexorably breached the defenses around his heart. The moment was shattered by a commotion at the edge of the square. Raised voices and the sound of breaking glass drew everyone's attention. Kieran instinctively moved Abigail behind him as Sheriff Morgan pushed through the crowd toward the disturbance. "Trouble," he murmured, recognizing the signs. "Stay here." Before Abigail could protest, he was moving toward the confrontation, where he found the sheriff facing off against three rough-looking men who were clearly deep in their cups. "We don't want any trouble tonight, Burke," the sheriff was saying to the largest of the three, a burly man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "Why don't you boys head on back to your camp and sleep it off?" "Ain't looking for trouble," the man called Burke slurred. "Just wanted to join the celebration. Ain't that right, boys?" His companions laughed, and one of them made a crude remark about the available women. Kieran tensed, scanning the crowd for Abigail, relieved to see that several of the town women had drawn her away from the confrontation. "You and your crew aren't welcome here, Burke," Sheriff Morgan stated firmly. "Not after what happened last time. Now move along before I have to put you in a cell for the night." Burke's face darkened. "You threatening me, lawman?" The situation was deteriorating quickly. Kieran stepped forward, putting himself at the sheriff's side. "Evening's over for you, Burke. Best listen to the sheriff." The scarred man's bloodshot eyes fixed on Kieran, narrowing in recognition. "Well, if it ain't the high-end mighty Dawson, still playing lord of that worthless stretch of dirt you call a ranch." His gaze shifted, focusing on something beyond Kieran's shoulder. "And who's the pretty little thing watching you play hero?" Kieran turned to see that Abigail had broken away from the women and moved closer, concern evident on her face. The possessive fury that rose in him at Burke's leering appraisal was both unexpected and overwhelming. "That's none of your concern," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now do as the sheriff says and move along." For a tense moment, it seemed Burke might escalate the confrontation. But a heavy hand on his shoulder from one of his more sober companions, and a warning glance from the sheriff, who had rested his hand on his pistol, changed his mind. "Another time," Burke muttered, spitting at Kieran's feet before allowing himself to be led away by his companions. "Sorry about that, folks," Sheriff Morgan called to the crowd. "Nothing to worry about. Band, how about another tune?" As the music reluctantly resumed, Kieran made his way to Abigail. "We should head back," he said, his voice still tight with anger. "Who was that man?" she asked as he escorted her toward their wagon, his hand protectively at her elbow. "Reed Burke, cattle rustler, troublemaker. Had a run-in with him last year when he tried to steal some of my stock." Kieran helped her into the wagon, then climbed up beside her. "He's harmless enough when he's outnumbered, but he holds a grudge." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the earlier lightheartedness of the day overshadowed by the confrontation. Kieran found himself scanning the darkening trail more vigilantly than usual, suddenly aware of Abigail's vulnerability, in ways he hadn't fully considered before. "I'm sorry the day ended on such a sour note," Abigail said as the ranch buildings came into view. "It was wonderful until then." Kieran glanced at her profile, silvered by moonlight. "It was," he agreed, surprising himself with the admission. "Been a long time since I enjoyed a town gathering." She turned to him with a small smile. "Perhaps we can do it again sometime." The simple statement carried implications that should have alarmed him: continuity, permanence, a future that included her presence. Instead, Kieran found himself nodding. "Perhaps we can." As he helped her down from the wagon, her hand lingered in his a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for protecting me tonight," she said softly, "though I wish you hadn't put yourself at risk." "Wasn't much risk," he replied, though the concern in her eyes warmed him in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. "Burke's all talk." Still, she reached up, her hand gentle against his cheek. "It matters to me that you were willing to stand between me and danger." Before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, then turned and hurried into the house, leaving Kieran standing in the yard with his heart hammering as if he'd run for miles. That night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, Kieran was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Abigail Reed had become more than a temporary guest in his home. She had become someone he looked forward to seeing each morning, someone whose smile could lighten his mood, someone whose safety and happiness mattered to him in ways that contradicted everything he believed about surviving on the frontier. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, it was the most dangerous thing he'd faced in years. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful distance Kieran had maintained began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative closeness neither of them acknowledged directly. Their evening conversations on the porch lengthened, their shared work around the ranch took on an easy rhythm, and Kieran found himself seeking out her company rather than avoiding it. October brought cooler temperatures and the need to prepare for winter. Kieran was splitting firewood one crisp morning when a rider approached, the telegraph operator's son from town. "Message for Miss Reed," the boy announced, handing over an envelope. "Pa said it was important." Abigail, who had been hanging laundry nearby, wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the telegram with a murmured thanks. Kieran watched as she read it, noting the way her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that looked remarkably like fear. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his axe and moving toward her. "It's from Uncle Maxwell," she said, her voice unsteady. "He says I need to return to St. Louis immediately, that there have been developments regarding my parents' estate, that I'm," she broke off, swallowing hard, "that I'm in danger if I stay here." Kieran felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What kind of danger? She shook her head. "He doesn't say, just that I should take the next stage and tell no one where I'm going." Her blue eyes lifted to his, filled with confusion. "I don't understand what could possibly have changed, and why the secrecy." Something about the situation raised Kieran's instincts for trouble. When's the last time you heard from your godfather? Not since the letter he sent saying he'd arranged for me to stay with you. Almost 2 months now. Kieran frowned, and this telegram doesn't sound like him, his usual way of expressing himself. Abigail reread the message, her brow furrowed. No, it doesn't. Uncle Maxwell is typically very precise in his communications. This is oddly vague. I think we need more information before you go anywhere, Kieran said, his protective instincts fully roused. I'll ride into town tomorrow, send a telegram to my uncle directly, confirm this message came from him. Relief washed over Abigail's face. You think it might not be genuine. I think caution costs us nothing but a day's delay, he replied, though privately he was already considering darker possibilities. That night, Kieran took the extra precaution of checking his rifles and keeping one loaded by the door. If someone was trying to lure Abigail away from the safety of the ranch, they might not stop at deceptive telegrams. His vigilance proved warranted when, in the darkest hour before dawn, the sound of breaking glass jolted him from sleep. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving silently toward Abigail's room. She met him in the hallway, wide-eyed but calm, a small derringer clutched in her hand. The sight momentarily surprised him. He hadn't known she was armed. Someone's trying to break in, she whispered. Through the kitchen window. Kieran nodded, impressed by her composure. Stay behind me, he murmured, moving toward the kitchen. The intruder was clumsy, making enough noise to wake the dead as he climbed through the broken window. Kieran rounded the corner, rifle raised, to find a familiar silhouette outlined against the faint moonlight. Don't move, Burke, he commanded, his voice hard. Next sound you make will be your last. The rustler froze, then slowly raised his hands. Easy, Dawson, just looking for the girl. Why? Kieran demanded, though he could guess the answer. Burke's laugh was ugly. Got a nice reward waiting for anyone who brings the Reed girl back to St. Louis. Dead or alive, though alive pays better. He squinted through the darkness. There she is, come on, sweetheart. Certain gentlemen's mighty anxious to see you. What gentleman? Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Fellow name of Holcomb, says you're his fiancée, run off with family jewels or some such. Don't much care about the details when the money's good. Kieran felt Abigail stiffen beside him. Richard Holcomb, she asked, her voice suddenly strained. That's the one, Burke confirmed. Rich fellow, generous when he wants something. I am not his fiancée, Abigail said, her voice low with anger. He was my father's business partner, and she broke off, then continued more firmly. He has no claim on me whatsoever. Kieran kept his rifle trained on Burke. You've got two choices, he told the rustler. Leave now and never come back, or I put a bullet in you and save the sheriff the trouble of a hanging. Burke seemed to consider his options, eyes darting between Kieran's unwavering rifle and Abigail's small but equally deadly derringer. Might be I made a mistake, he said finally. Might be I heard wrong about who wanted the girl. Might be you did, Kieran agreed coldly. Now get out and Burke. You come near her again, I won't give you a choice next time. The rustler backed toward the window, hands still raised. No need for threats, Dawson, just business, nothing personal. It's personal to me, Kieran replied, the simple truth of the statement resonating through him as Burke climbed awkwardly back out the window and disappeared into the night. Once certain the danger had passed, Kieran lowered his rifle and turned to Abigail. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes were clear and focused. You want to tell me what that was about? He asked gently. Who is this Holcomb, really? Abigail sank into a kitchen chair, the derringer still clutched in her hand. Richard Holcomb was my father's business partner in the shipping company. After my father died, he approached me with a business proposition, marriage. He said it would keep the company in the family and secure my future. Her voice hardened. What he didn't say was that he'd been systematically embezzling from the company for years. My father was beginning to suspect just before he fell ill. How do you know about the embezzlement? Kieran asked, sitting across from her. I found my father's private ledgers. He'd been tracking discrepancies. When I confronted Richard with what I'd found, She hesitated, her hand unconsciously moving to her wrist as if remembering a painful grip. He wasn't pleased, said no one would believe the accusations of a grieving, hysterical woman. That it would be better for everyone if I simply became his wife and forgot what I'd seen. The implication of threat in her words made Kieran's blood run cold. "So you ran?" She nodded. "I wrote to Uncle Maxwell, sent him copies of the ledgers. He arranged for me to come here while he took the evidence to the authorities." Her eyes widened in sudden realization. That telegram, it wasn't from Uncle Maxwell at all. It was from Richard trying to lure me back. "Or away from protection," Kieran agreed grimly. "Burke may have failed, but Holcomb doesn't sound like the type to give up easily." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, and the simple inclusiveness of the question, we not I, struck Kieran forcefully. "First light we ride to town, send telegrams to my uncle and the authorities in St. Louis, find out where things stand with the investigation." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "But know this, Abigail, I won't let anyone take you anywhere against your will. Not Burke, not Holcomb, not anyone." The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised even him, but the grateful warmth in Abigail's eyes made any embarrassment worth it. "I've never had anyone stand for me like that," she said softly. "Thank you." "Get some rest," he replied, rising from the table. "I'll keep watch till morning." She stood as well but hesitated before returning to her room. "Kieran, I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door. You built this place to be away from such complications, and now—" "Now I'm glad you're here," he interrupted, the words coming unbidden but true. "Trouble or not." The smile she gave him then was worth 1,000 peaceful, solitary nights. True to his word, Kieran took Abigail to town at first light. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where they sent urgent messages to both Maxwell Dawson and the St. Louis police. The operator promised to deliver any replies as soon as they arrived. Their second stop was the sheriff's office, where they reported Burke's break-in and the apparent bounty on Abigail. "I'll keep an eye out for him and his boys," Sheriff Morgan assured them. "But Dawson, you might want to consider extra precautions. Burke's not the only gun for hire in these parts who might be tempted by reward money." Kieran nodded grimly. "Already planning on it." They were just leaving the sheriff's office when a commotion at the stagecoach stop caught their attention. A well-dressed man had disembarked and was speaking urgently to the station manager, who pointed in their direction. Abigail's grip on Kieran's arm tightened painfully. "It's him," she whispered, her face draining of color. "Richard Holcomb." Kieran assessed the newcomer quickly. Holcomb was perhaps 40, expensively dressed in an Eastern suit that marked him immediately as an outsider. He carried himself with the confidence of wealth and privilege, but the cold calculation in his eyes as they fixed on Abigail revealed something harder beneath the polished exterior. "Miss Reed," Holcomb called, approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a relief to find you safe and sound. You've had us all terribly worried." "I doubt that," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than Kieran would have expected. "What are you doing here, Richard?" "Why, I've come to escort you home, of course." Holcomb's gaze shifted to Kieran, dismissive in its brief assessment. "Thank you for looking after Miss Reed, Mr. Dawson." "Kieran Dawson." He made no move to shake the offered hand. "And Abigail isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Something dangerous flickered in Holcomb's expression before his smooth facade reasserted itself. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Dawson. Miss Reed is my fiancée, temporarily unwell from the shock of her parents' passing. Her doctors have been most concerned about her. Delusions regarding business matters she couldn't possibly understand." "I am not your fiancée," Abigail stated firmly, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. "Nor am I delusional. You stole from my father's company, and when I discovered the proof, you threatened me. That's why I left St. Louis." Holcomb's smile tightened. "You see what I mean." These wild accusations, a symptom of her condition. I have documentation from her family physician. "Save it," Kieran interrupted. "Sheriff's right over there if you want to press your claim legally. Otherwise, I suggest you get back on that stage when it leaves." The businessman's veneer of civility slipped further. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. Abigail is coming back to St. Louis where she belongs. One way or another." "Is that a threat?" Kieran asked, his hand moving unconsciously toward his pistol. "Merely a statement of fact," Holcomb replied smoothly. "I have resources, Mr. Dawson, and I will use them to recover what is mine." She isn't yours, Kieran stated, his voice deadly quiet. She isn't property to be recovered. She's a free woman who's made her choice, and that choice isn't you. A tense silence fell over the street. Sheriff Morgan had noticed the confrontation and was making his way toward them, hand resting on his gun belt. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between the three of them. "No problem at all, Sheriff," Holcomb replied, his mask of civility firmly back in place. "Just a misunderstanding. I'll be staying at your local hotel for a few days while Miss Reed and I sort out our differences of opinion." With a curt nod, he turned and walked toward the hotel, his stiff posture betraying his anger. "You all right, Miss Reed?" the sheriff asked once Holcomb was out of earshot. "Yes, thank you," she replied, though her face remained pale. "We should get back to the ranch," Kieran said, his instincts screaming that Holcomb wasn't the type to give up easily. "Sheriff, if that telegram reply comes." "I'll send someone out with it right away," Morgan assured him. The ride back to the ranch was tense, both of them scanning the trail for signs of ambush. Kieran's mind raced with plans and precautions. The ranch was defensible, but they were isolated. Help would be hours away if Holcomb made a move. "He won't stop," Abigail said softly as the ranch buildings came into view. "Richard always gets what he wants, one way or another. It's why he was such a successful businessman." "He hasn't dealt with me before," Kieran replied with grim confidence. "Or with a woman who's willing to stand up to him, I'd wager." She gave him a small smile. "That's true enough. Most of Richard's acquaintances are either intimidated by his wealth or impressed by it. Few have seen the man behind the money." As they dismounted in the ranch yard, Kieran made a decision. "Pack what you need for a few days. We're not staying here tonight." Abigail looked at him questioningly. "Where are we going?" "There's a line shack up in the high pasture. Difficult to find if you don't know it's there. We'll be safer away from the main house until we hear back from the telegrams." She nodded, trusting his judgment without question. "I'll be ready in 10 minutes. True to her word, Abigail emerged from the house with a small bundle of necessities. Kieran had already loaded his rifle and extra ammunition, along with food supplies and water. They set out immediately, taking a circuitous route through the rugged terrain to mask their destination. The line shack was primitive but sturdy, a single room with a small stove, a narrow cot, and basic furnishings for the times when winter weather made it necessary for Kieran to stay overnight while checking on cattle in the distant pastures. "It's not much," he apologized as they dismounted, "but it's defensible." "It's perfect," Abigail assured him, surveying the simple structure with approval rather than dismay. "And the view is magnificent." The shack stood on a small rise, offering a panoramic view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. In different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant retreat. As sunset approached, Kieran built a small fire in the stove, careful to use only dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. Abigail prepared a simple meal from their supplies, and they ate in companionable silence, the weight of the day's events heavy between them. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Even if the telegrams confirm my story, Richard won't simply give up and go home." Kieran considered his response carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen. If you want to return to St. Louis once it's safe, I'll make sure you get there. If you want to stay in Arizona territory, well..." He hesitated, aware he was approaching dangerous ground. "There would be a place for you here, if you wanted it." The implications of his offer hung in the air between them. Abigail's eyes, luminous in the fading light, searched his face. "Are you offering me a job, Kieran Dawson, or something else entirely?" Her directness caught him off guard. "I'm not sure I know myself," he admitted. "A month ago, I would have said the worst thing that could happen to me was having someone else to worry about. Someone who could be used against me, someone who might leave." He paused, gathering his courage. "Now I'm thinking the worst thing might be watching you go." The simple honesty of his words seemed to affect her deeply. Abigail moved from her seat to kneel beside him, her hand finding his. "I haven't wanted to presume," she said softly. "You've been so kind, so protective, but I wasn't sure if it was just your nature or if perhaps—" "It's not just my nature," Kieran interrupted, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept contained too long. "It's you, Abigail. You make me want things I'd convinced myself were foolish dreams out here, a home that's more than shelter, a life that's more than survival. Her free hand rose to his face, gentle against his cheek. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I came here broken and afraid, running from danger. I never expected to find someone who would make me feel safe again. Someone who would see me, not as a fragile thing to be protected, but as a woman of value. Of strength." Kieran turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss to its center. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known." The tenderness of the moment was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching from the valley below. Kieran was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. In the fading light, he could make out 4 riders making their way up the trail that led to the high pasture. "Burke," he muttered, recognizing the lead rider even at a distance. "And he's brought friends." Abigail joined him at the window, her earlier vulnerability replaced by resolute calm. "How did they find us?" "Must have been watching the ranch, saw us leave." Kieran reached for his rifle. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. You should hide in the root cellar." "I won't hide while you face them alone," she replied firmly, retrieving her derringer from her pocket. "We face this together." Kieran wanted to argue, to insist she stay safe, but the determination in her eyes told him it would be futile. And in truth, there was no place she could hide that would truly be safe if he fell. "Stay low and behind cover," he instructed, quickly barricading the door and positioning furniture to create defensive positions. "And Abigail, if something happens to me, don't hesitate. Use that derringer and run. The mare knows the way back to town." She nodded, though the flash in her eyes suggested she had no intention of leaving him, regardless of what happened. The riders approached cautiously, spreading out to surround the small shack. Kieran counted 4 men: Burke, 2 of his usual companions, and a 4th man whose expensive clothing marked him as out of place among the rough frontiersmen. "Holcomb," Abigail breathed, confirming Kieran's suspicion. He didn't waste any time. "Dawson," Burke's voice called from the gathering darkness. "Send out the girl and we'll let you live. Holcomb just wants what's his." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Kieran shouted back. "And I've got a clear shot at all 4 of you. First man who makes a move gets a bullet." There was a murmur of conversation outside, then Holcomb's cultured voice carried clearly through the evening air. "Miss Reed, be reasonable. You're only making things worse for yourself. Come back to St. Louis with me, and I promise no charges will be filed against you for the theft of company documents." "The only thief here is you, Richard," Abigail called out, her voice steady. "And those documents are safely with the authorities by now. It's over." A tense silence followed her declaration. Kieran kept his rifle trained on the shadowy figures outside, knowing the standoff couldn't last indefinitely. Sooner or later, Burke and his men would make a move. He didn't have to wait long. A flicker of movement to the left was his only warning before a shot rang out, splintering the window frame inches from his head. Kieran returned fire instinctively, rewarded by a cry of pain from the darkness. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Burke and his remaining companion laid down covering fire, while Holcomb attempted to circle around to the back of the shack. Kieran methodically returned fire, conscious of his limited ammunition and the need to make each shot count. Abigail proved her worth in the crisis, reloading his spare rifle with steady hands and even firing a surprisingly accurate shot that sent one of the attackers scrambling for better cover. "They're trying to get to the back door," she warned, peering carefully through a crack in the wall. Kieran nodded grimly. The small shack had only 2 entrances, the front door and a rear door that led to a small storage area. He'd barricaded both, but determined men with enough firepower could eventually break through. A sudden crash confirmed his fears. Someone was attempting to force the back door. Kieran moved to respond, but as he did, the front window shattered completely as Burke fired directly through it. The shot missed Kieran but struck the oil lamp, plunging the shack into darkness as the lamp shattered. A small fire started where the oil spilled, providing erratic illumination but also creating a new danger. "Put it out," Kieran ordered, moving to cover the back door. "Use the blanket." Abigail complied without hesitation, smothering the small blaze with a wool blanket. The darkness worked to their advantage, making them harder targets, but it also meant they couldn't see their attackers as clearly. The pounding at the back door intensified. Kieran braced himself, rifle aimed at the weakening barrier. When it finally splintered open, he fired without hesitation, rewarded by another cry of pain. "Enough," came Holcomb's voice tight with fury. "Burn them out. The girl's as good to me dead as alive at this point." The threat sent ice through Kieran's veins. A moment later, a flaming torch arced through the broken window, landing on the wooden floor. Abigail moved to extinguish it, but a second followed, then a third, each landing in a different area of the small space. "We need to get out," Kieran said urgently, recognizing the deadliness of their situation. A wooden shack in the dry Arizona wilderness would become an inferno within minutes. Abigail nodded, her face resolute in the growing firelight. "The root cellar. We could get out through there." The small cellar, dug into the ground beneath a trapdoor in the floor, had a narrow tunnel that led to an external entrance, designed to provide access during heavy snows. It was their only chance. As Kieran helped Abigail into the cellar, shots continued to pepper the shack, the attackers clearly intending to kill them if they attempted to flee the growing blaze. The heat was becoming intense, the smoke thickening with each passing second. "Go," he urged, helping her into the narrow tunnel. "I'll be right behind you." "Promise me," she insisted, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "I promise," he replied, meaning it. The realization struck him forcefully. He wanted to live, not just survive, but live with her. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Kieran's shoulders and completely dark. They crawled forward by feel, the sounds of the burning shack and gunfire growing more distant. The external entrance was hidden in a thicket of scrub brush, deliberately obscured to prevent snow from blocking it during winter. Emerging into the cool night air, they stayed low, using the brush as cover. The shack was now fully engulfed in flames, illuminating the clearing in a hellish glow. Burke and his men were still firing occasionally into the burning structure, apparently unaware that their quarry had escaped. "We need to get to the horses," Kieran whispered, orienting himself. He had tethered their mounts in a small copse of trees about 50 yards away, out of sight of the main trail. Moving silently through the underbrush, they had almost reached the horses when a voice from behind froze them in place. "That's far enough." Richard Holcomb stood 10 yards away, a pistol aimed steadily at them. His expensive suit was dirty and torn, his face smudged with soot, but the cold determination in his eyes was unchanged. "It's over, Richard," Abigail said, slowly rising to her feet. "Even if you kill us both, the evidence against you still exists. You've only made things worse by coming after me this way." "Perhaps," he acknowledged with chilling calm. "But I'll have the satisfaction of ensuring you don't profit from your betrayal. Your father built that company from nothing, and you were willing to see it destroyed rather than accept my offer." "My father built it honestly," she countered. "You're the one destroying his legacy with your greed." Holcomb's expression hardened. "Enough talk. Step away from her, cowboy. This doesn't concern you." Kieran didn't move. "It concerns me very much," he replied evenly. "You see, I intend to marry her." The declaration, made without prior thought or discussion, hung in the night air. Kieran felt Abigail's startled gaze on him, but kept his attention fixed on Holcomb, whose momentary surprise gave way to cold amusement. "How touching," the businessman sneered. "The cowboy and the heiress, a romantic tale indeed, one that ends here." He raised his pistol, aiming deliberately at Kieran's chest. What happened next occurred so quickly that Kieran would later struggle to recall the precise sequence of events. Abigail moved suddenly, placing herself partially in front of him. Simultaneously, a shot rang out, not from Holcomb's pistol, but from somewhere behind them. Holcomb staggered, a look of profound surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. He fell to his knees, then collapsed forward, his unfired pistol dropping from nerveless fingers. "That's for my brother, you eastern vulture," came a gruff voice from the darkness. Sheriff Morgan stepped into the firelight, rifle still raised. Behind him were several deputies and townsmen. "Sheriff," Kieran acknowledged, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "Your timing is impeccable." "Got a telegraph reply," Morgan explained, approaching cautiously to confirm Holcomb was no longer a threat. "From your uncle and the St. Louis police. Seems Miss Reed's story checks out. Thought you might need a hand when we spotted Burke and his boys riding out with Holcomb." He glanced toward the burning shack. "Though we clearly didn't arrive as promptly as we should have." "You're here now," Abigail said gratefully. "That's what matters." A commotion from the direction of the shack, indicated the deputies had apprehended Burke and his remaining companion. The third man, wounded in the initial exchange, had apparently fled. "What happens now?" Kieran asked, his arm protectively around Abigail's shoulders. "Now, assuming Miss Reed is willing to sign a statement, Holcomb's associates in St. Louis will face prosecution." As for Burke, the sheriff's expression darkened. "He won't be troubling anyone again. Attempted murder carries a heavy sentence in the territory." As the group made their way back down to the valley, Kieran and Abigail rode side by side, the events of the night creating a strange sense of unreality. "Did you mean it?" Abigail asked softly when they had fallen slightly behind the others. "What you said to Richard about intending to marry me?" Kieran met her gaze in the moonlight, all his carefully constructed defenses finally, completely dismantled. "I did," he replied simply, "though I'd have preferred to ask you properly without a gun pointed at us." Her smile was radiant despite the soot that smudged her cheek. "Then ask me now." Kieran reined his horse to a stop, and Abigail did the same. In the silver light of the moon, with the distant mountains as witness, he took her hand in his. "Abigail Reed, I've spent 6 years believing the frontier was no place for love, that a man could only survive out here by standing alone. You've proven me wrong in every possible way." His voice roughened with emotion. "I love you. Will you marry me? Build a life with me at the Broken Arrow?" Tears shimmered in her eyes, catching the moonlight like diamonds. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times, yes. I love you, Kieran Dawson, and I can't imagine a life anywhere else but here with you." The wedding took place the following spring, when the desert bloomed briefly with wildflowers. The Broken Arrow was transformed for the occasion, with lanterns hanging from the corral fences and tables set out beneath the cottonwood trees. It seemed the entire population of Willow Creek turned out to witness the union of the once reclusive rancher and the Eastern lady who had captured his heart. Maxwell Dawson traveled from St. Louis for the ceremony, bringing news that Holcomb's former associates had been prosecuted and that Abigail's father's company had been restored to honest management. The inheritance that was rightfully hers would provide a comfortable financial cushion for the young couple, though both insisted the ranch would remain their primary focus and investment. Sheriff Morgan served as Kieran's best man, a friendship having developed between the two men in the aftermath of the confrontation at the line shack. The sheriff's wife had taken Abigail under her wing, helping her prepare for the ceremony and sharing the particular wisdom of a woman who had successfully built a life on the frontier. As they exchanged their vows beneath the azure Arizona sky, Kieran marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a year. The man who had once believed isolation was the price of survival now found himself surrounded by community, friendship, and most miraculous of all, love. Later, as lanterns glowed and music played and their guests celebrated long into the evening, Kieran led his bride in their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, holding her close as they moved across the improvised dance floor. Abigail's smile was answer enough, but she replied nonetheless. "Completely, though I still can't quite believe how we came to be here. If my godfather hadn't sent me to you. If you hadn't brought trouble to my doorstep," Kieran added with a wry smile, "I might have spent the rest of my life alone, convinced it was the only way to survive out here." "And instead," she prompted, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Instead, I've discovered that surviving isn't enough, that a life worth living requires risk, connection." He drew her closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Love." As the last light of day faded from the western sky, casting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Kieran Dawson finally and completely let go of the false belief that had shaped so many years of his life. The frontier wasn't a place where a man had to stand alone to survive. It was a place where the right partnership could create something stronger, more enduring than any individual could build on their own. The Broken Arrow would thrive in the years to come, expanding its operations and becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its stock. Children would eventually fill the ranch house with laughter, the next generation of Dawsons learning the ways of the land from parents who faced its challenges together. But on that perfect spring evening, with his bride in his arms and their future stretching before them, Kieran was simply grateful for the trouble that had arrived on his doorstep in the form of a young woman with honey-blonde hair, and the courage to face down both frontier hardship and eastern treachery with equal grace. Some troubles, it turned out, were worth embracing after all.